Hello everyone. I recently had a problem with my 2017 Mercedes Sprinter 2500 with the antenna. The problem started with our navigation system stopped receiving input from the GPS, and the problem was kind of intermittent. We ignored it for a while, just rebooted the navigation system and everything would work fine. But then a few weeks ago, the overhead console up by the rearview mirror started dripping water, so I realized I had to do something about it. Unfortunately, I didn't remember until I'd almost finished the repair that other people might benefit from from learning about what I did. So I'm going to have to kind of go about it sideways. I'll show you how I put it back together because I forgot to take video of how I took it apart. But hopefully that'll be all right. One of the first problems with this repair was just getting to the site. I was able to get to the antenna underneath from inside the van, but getting to the site on the surface of the van or on the top of the van wasn't that easy. I ended up using my tractor to do that. So here's my redneck scaffold for crawling out to the antenna mount site on the van. So before I could do the repair, of course, I had to access the antenna, and the first thing that had to happen is at the very top of the headliner there was a blank plate, and then this mounting chassis for some piece of equipment that I don't have, so that had to be popped out with these little tabs right here. Had to be depressed enough for it to pop out, and then it just slid out of the van. The next thing that had to happen was that the light assembly, the overhead light assembly, had to be taken out, and it flips into the top of the van on these hooks here, and on the left side, or the driver's side, and then snaps in with these metal latches here. So when you're removing it, you just have to go to the passenger side of the assembly and push in on these two little metal latches, and it will drop out and flip down off of these little plastic hooks right here and right here. And then once you've done that, you'll have access to the wires, and you can disconnect all the wires, and then you'll be able to remove the antenna. So here's what the mount looks like from the underside. The antenna assembly comes in a few different parts. The first one is the antenna mast, number 3 in this diagram, and then there's the antenna assembly, number 1, I guess, in this diagram, that the mast screws into, and that has an attached wiring harness. And then there's the nut, number 2, that holds the whole thing onto the van. Now, my problem was that the gasket for the antenna base was crumbled up and wasn't keeping water out. So I thought, well, I'll just replace the gasket. Well, it turns out the gasket is integrated into this plastic base. I'm not sure how that process works, but it's sort of a soft rubber on the bottom and a hard plastic on the top. So I thought, well, I'll just buy the cover, the little plastic cover from Mercedes. And when I did that, I was given a part number 906-820-01-12-64. And when that came in, it turned out to be just a cover and a nut and a little gasket to block the hole that the antenna goes into, or the antenna assembly goes into, in the top of the van. And so it didn't do anything to repair the antenna, obviously. So I went down to the Mercedes dealer, and I said, well, can I get just the plastic cover? And no, you can't. You can get the whole assembly for let's see, $354. That's 906-820-01-75, well, I didn't want to spend $354 for an antenna that was working, apart from shipping water and having some corrosion on it. So when you take this thing off, you have to undo the nut, number 2, from underneath, and then it's stuck on with some sticky material, double-sided tape apparently, and you have to scrape that off with a plastic scraper, and then the whole thing will come loose. So when you do that, scrape off the remainder of that rubber stuff, and it will reveal 5 T9 Torx screws, and you can unscrew those and then take the electronics assembly out from underneath the plastic cover. So I did that, and then what I did was I made a little jig so that I could recreate this gasket. I cut off all the crumbled up rubber that I could after taking the electronics assembly out, and I cleaned up the corrosion that was in the electronics assembly underneath as well as I could. Now, it's kind of funny because when you screw the electronics assembly into the plastic cover with these 5 Torx screws, there's a little metal finger on the electronics assembly, and it makes contact with the screw mount for the antenna mast that's embedded in the plastic cover. So that is what had gotten corroded, and that's why my GPS wasn't working. So before I put the whole thing back together, I cleaned up that corrosion pretty well, and then I put some conductive grease antioxidant underneath there between the little metal finger and the screw-in for the antenna mast, so hopefully that won't corrode again. Once I'd removed all the crumbled up old rubber material from the bottom of the plastic cover, I wanted to make a new gasket, and I could have probably just used some kind of rubber sheet and cut out a piece that was roughly shaped the same as the antenna assembly. But instead of that, what I did was I formed a gasket out of silicone sealant, and I needed something that I could remove later. I didn't want to just squirt the silicone sealant onto the side of the van or onto the top of the van. So instead, what I did was I made a little jig so I could squirt the silicone in, and I used this Teflon sheet. This stuff, you can see I cut a piece of it out for the antenna. This stuff, the silicone won't stick to this stuff, and so I was able to make a flat mating surface of the gasket that was up against this Teflon, and then pull it off later because the silicone doesn't stick to the Teflon. I'm going to put a link to where you can order this Teflon sheet from Amazon. It's like three roughly 2 square foot sheets for $6 from Amazon or something like that. I'll put a link to that in the description. So once I got the antenna assembly inside, I took it all apart. As I said, it was stuck onto the van with this sticky material. I used a plastic scraper to get most of that off, and then used Goo Gone to get the rest of it off. And that revealed the 5 Torx screws that I needed to take loose to get the electronics assembly loose from the plastic cover. While I had the electronics assembly out, I cleaned up the corrosion in there as well as I could and put that conductive grease on that little metal finger that I was talking about before. And then I had to use a razor blade on the plastic cover to get rid of all that crumbled up rubber material that was bonded to the plastic cover. And then I needed to make myself a jig assembly to mount everything to that would leave a gap between the plastic cover and the base plate or the electronics plate so that I could make my new gasket with silicone. So for my jig assembly, I used this Teflon sheet that's for ironing things that might melt with the heat of the iron to keep the melted stuff from sticking to the iron. And as you can see, the silicone doesn't stick to this Teflon sheet. So I put that on after I'd cleaned up the electronics assembly and put it back together with the plastic cover. Then I put this Teflon sheet on. So once I had the electronics assembly cleaned up and I had all the old crumbled gasket material cut away, I put on this double-sided mounting tape, high-strength mounting tape, and then I put these popsicle sticks in there to give me the gap that I needed between the double stick tape and the flat part of my new gasket. And while I was at it, I went ahead and filled the entryway where the wires go in with silicone, so hopefully no water will get up into the electronics assembly through that path anymore. So after that was all done, I put the Teflon sheet on. And then the next thing I needed was something flat, a flat piece of wood to simulate the surface of the van that my gasket was going to be resting against eventually. And so after I'd put the latex sheet onto the antenna assembly, I put this board onto it, and then a washer to simulate the metal of the van. And then finally, everything was screwed together with the antenna mounting nut tightened down hand tight. And then that left me a place. Now let's turn it this way. Left me a place with a gap where I could squirt the silicone into the gap to form the new gasket. Once the silicone was dried, then I used a razor blade to just cut away at the thin edge of the little bead of silicone that I'd made, and that way there wouldn't be like a ragged edge on the new gasket. Then once I had that gasket edge cut off, then I was ready to put the antenna back on the van. So I peeled off the backing from the high-strength mounting tape, and the popsicle sticks came off with it. And so, as you can see, there's a little bit of a gap between the edge of the gasket and the mounting tape, and hopefully when I screw down the nut, all of that will stick together and make a weather-tight seal for the van. So here's the antenna mounted on the van at last. Hopefully it will work. So here's what the mount looks like from the underside. And here are the 3 wires that the antenna needs to plug into. The white one is for the 12 volts, and then the other 2 are for the antenna. One for GPS and one for radio. As you can see, they're color-coded. So there are the wires hooked up, and now it's time for a smoke test. Well, that's where we're supposed to be, but doesn't look like we got any satellites yet. Oh, there we go. Looks like we got 8 satellites, so looks like we're good to go. Okay, so now all the wires are hooked back up on this overhead console unit, and it's time to just flip it back into the van. As I said, these 2 little hooks on the driver's side just sort of flip into the headliner. And then there are 2 little clips, metal clips on the right side. So there it is, that console unit back in the van. I found out the hard way, by the way. This whole thing, the wiring passes through this thing for the uh, wiper sensor, for the outside ambient light sensor that brightens and dims the in the cockpit displays. So, and it also contains the microphone for the hands-free. So without this, a lot of the functions are disabled. So the last thing to do is to put this bracket assembly for the piece of equipment that I don't have back in, and then the blank cover that goes on front of it, and we'll be done. Well, there you have it. The system works fine now, and I didn't have to put out the $300 and some odd to get a whole new antenna assembly. So hopefully someone else can benefit from hearing what I did. In retrospect, I might have been able to just fix this by getting some sort of plastic or rubber sheet and cutting it out to a little bit bigger than the shape of the antenna and just screwing it on there. But hey, that would have been easy. Enjoy.